Good morning, everyone. This is Doug. This will be episode 30 in our series, Famous Quotes on Paul. The person we're focusing on today is H.G. Wells. He was an historian. He wrote a famous book in 1921 we're going to look at, and he was a writer of many works. We'll discuss some of those. They're very famous as well. H.G. Wells admires Jesus' revolutionary moral teachings, we'll learn, for salvation, but laments Paul did away with them, Paul replacing Jesus' teachings with a substitute system with none of the moral content for salvation that Jesus taught. And here's just a quick snippet of that from the book. H.G. Wells, St. Paul substituted another doctrine for the plain and profoundly revolutionary teachings of Jesus. H.G. Wells, Outline of History, 1921. So let's take a look. Who is he? Britannica, H.G. Wells, born 1866. He died 1946. He was born in London, or he died in London. He was born in Kent, England. He was an English novelist, journalist, sociologist, and historian, best known for such science fiction novels as The Time Machine and The War of the Worlds. In 1883, he was an usher at Midhurst Grammar School. At 18, he's still a young person doing this usher work, he won a scholarship to study biology at the Normal School, later called the Royal College of Science, in South Kensington, London, where T.H. Huxley was one of his teachers, famous scientist. He graduated from London University in 1888, becoming a science teacher. His early writings. Wells first published his book called his first book was a textbook of biology in 1893. So he started off just writing science. Then he started with a novel, and that's a big part of his life. With his first novel, The Time Machine, if you don't know that was made into a movie, which was immediately successful. He began a series of science fiction novels that revealed him as a writer and marked originality and an immense fecundity of ideas. The Wonderful Visit, 1895. The Island of Dr. Moreau, also made into a movie, 1896. The Invisible Man, also made into a movie. The War of the Worlds, made into multiple movies. The First Men in the Moon, I think was made into a movie. And The Food of the Gods, 1904. He also wrote many short stories, which were collected in The Stolen Bacillus, 1895, and so on and so forth. This is interesting. For a time, he acquired a reputation as a prophet for the future, and indeed, in The War in the Air, 1908, he foresaw certain developments in the military use of aircraft. Now, you have to know aircraft had not been flown with people in it and all this kind of stuff and never used as weapons. But his imagination flourished at its best, not in the manner of the comparatively mechanical anticipations of Jules Verne, but in the astronomical fantasies of the First Men in the Moon and the famous book called The War of the Worlds, again made into multiple movies, from the latter of which the image of Martians has passed into popular mythology. Wells began as an ambitious work of popular education. So a certain part of his life, he decided to just stop doing fiction and do things to help the public get better acquainted with history, starting with history and then science. So he did a work called Outline of History, 1920, revised 1931, but we're actually going to look at the 1921 republication today. Here is the actual face page, The Outline of History, being a plain history of life and mankind by H.G. Wells, written originally with the advice and editorial help of Mr. Ernest Barker, Sir H.H. Johnson, Sir E. Ray Lancaster, and Professor Gilbert Murray. And this is the third edition, revised and rearranged by the author in 1921, published in New York. All right, so now let's turn to his substantive quotes, beginning at page 952. Now, upon that matter, the teller of modern history is obliged to be at once cautious and bold. He has to pick his way between cowardly evasion on the one hand and partisanship on the other. As far as possible, he must confine himself to facts and restrain his opinions. He's telling you this because he's trying to talk about Jesus and Paul. Yet, it is well to remember that no opinions can be altogether restrained. So he's going to admit that he's going to tell you he likes Jesus. The writer has his own very strong and definite persuasions, and the reader must bear that in mind. It is a fact in history that the teaching of Jesus of Nazareth had in it something profoundly new and creative. He preached a new kingdom of heaven in the hearts and in the world of men. There was nothing in his teaching, so far as we can judge it is at this distance of time, to clash or interfere with any discovery or expansion of the history of the world and mankind. So nothing about it was ever disproven to be invalid by anything in history in the past or in the future of mankind. So those principles seem to stand the test of time, is what he's saying. But it is equally a fact in history that St. Paul and his successors added to, or completed, or imposed upon, or substituted another doctrine for, as you may prefer to think, the plain and profoundly revolutionary teachings of Jesus by expounding a subtle and complex theory of salvation, a salvation which could be attained very largely by belief and formalities, without any serious disturbance of the believer's ordinary habits and occupations, and that this Pauline teaching did involve very definite beliefs about the history of the world and man. It is not the business of the historian to controvert or explain these matters. The question of their ultimate significance depends upon the theologian. The historian's concern is merely with the fact that official Christianity throughout the world adopted St. Paul's view, so plainly expressed in his epistles and untraceable in the Gospels. Do you see what he's saying? It's unquestionable fact. From the Roman Catholic Church period onward, my friends, from that forward onward, it abandoned all the messages of Jesus and all focused on Paul. And that's for salvation's sake, at least in the main part, predestination, in particular by Augustine, but not always faith alone in Augustine as well. But basically, this whole church system turned against God's law, said you shouldn't follow it. In fact, you're cursed. In the Council of Laodicea of 363, if you keep Sabbath anymore, you're cursed, you're anathema, and you can't be regarded as a Christian at all. That's how bad it got. And that the meaning of religion lay not in the future, but in the past, and that Jesus was not so much a teacher of wonderful new things as a predestinate divine blood sacrifice of deep mystery and sacredness made in atonement of a particular historical act of disobedience to the Creator committed by our first parents, Adam and Eve, in response to the temptation of a serpent in the Garden of Eden. He's talking about Paul's doctrine of original sin. So through Adam, whether we sinned or not, we're all sinners. So even children who have not sinned yet, they're all sinners too, because they're offspring of Adam and Eve. So just, that's where the doctrine of baptism came in for children, because what are we going to do? They're all born sinners. Therefore, we have to baptize them and cleanse them and save them and regenerate them before they live a day or two. So you have to baptize them as fast as you can to save their souls, because they're unregenerate and they're sinners from birth. And that's what he's talking about. That's what Catholicism had taught in the time period he was even teaching still in this day of the 1921 period. Upon the belief in that fall as a fact, and not upon the personality of Jesus of Nazareth, upon the theories of Paul, and not upon the injunction of Jesus, doctrinal Christianity built itself. All right, so that's basically all I wanted to quote for you. There's nothing else I want to go into, except he's going to talk about Constantine, and I'm going to put this in a separate video called Famous Quotes on Constantine. Very interesting comments he makes. But his observation here is purely historical, purely comparison of these two teachings, two very different teachings, Jesus versus Paul, very different world and very different outcome. And I believe Jesus called it what? The easy way. Jesus said there's a difficult way that I teach, and there's the easy way that I don't teach. I mean, that's basically what he says. It profoundly shake the faith of any person who follows Paul and follows any of his teachings. Listen to this, please. Matthew 7, verse 13 to 14, English Standard Version. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide, and the way is easy that leads to salvation. Oh, no. That leads to destruction. And those who enter it are many. Now, watch what happens next. Compare many to what Jesus says are those who are going to be saved. Are they the majority? Verse 14, for the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are very many, much more. But the majority of people will find salvation. No, are the few. So if you live in a world where it's so easy to get saved, I put up my hand, I accept Christ as the Savior in my heart, blah, 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 and I don't have to change and do any moral injunctions. That's all for rewards or whatever, but I'm saved by just believing in faith alone. That's what Paul teaches in Romans 4. That's what he teaches in Ephesians 2, 8-9. You're saved by faith, not works. Don't do anything. In fact, if you do it, you may boast. So that's what he says in Ephesians 2, 8-9. Very obvious what the message of Jesus is. What's interesting is here you have an historian who's simply doing historical comparisons between the two voices, the two messages. One's easy, one's hard, and that's the clear, obvious extraction anybody would make just reading the two. And that's what he did. And I like just the fact that he didn't do anything about doctrine. He didn't try to extrapolate it into how would you apply those facts to what Jesus said but this is how you would apply it. You would conclude those people, which are going to be the majority of people, who are going to be lost, will be distracted by the message that's easy and accept that because it's easy. And they will disregard and claim and disparage the way that's hard as somehow earning your salvation, or somehow you're doing something unrighteous, or seeking to do something that will cause you to boast. I mean, it's everything to discourage you from living a righteous life is as much as possible as the mechanism that God requires for salvation, and they'll call it earning salvation. And I just want to make one quick more observation from the Ten Commandments, where God says how you're saved. It's right in the Ten Commandments. We say we believe in the Ten Commandments, but you know what? Between the first and the second is the following. What does it say in Exodus 20, verse 6? The first commandment has just preceded it. The second commandment is coming up, right? This is the Ten Commandments, and you all say, well, we honor the Ten Commandments, but you do not look at the message of salvation staring you right in your face. And showing mercy, grace, same word, meaning mercy unto thousands of generations that love me and what? Keep my commandments. And so then you got to go look up what the commandments apply to you. You're a Gentile. You're called a sojourner in the law, the foreigner sometimes in other words, but it's the word ger in Hebrew. And it says 166 times the commandments that apply to you. Pretty much repetitious, by the way. There's a very narrow set. And then there's 600 times it says children of Israel. They got to keep those commandments. And so sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't. So that's how I study as a lawyer carefully what is the obligation of the sojourner versus the children of Israel. And so there are commandments that you have to follow, and it's just the way it is. Some are for salvation, and what are those? Oh, guess what? The 10 commandments. Jesus is asked, how do I have eternal life? He says, obey the commandments, and starts rattling off the 10. That guy interrupts him, and he starts giving him another commandment because he never gave any charity to the poor. And Jesus makes that a big deal in Matthew 25. If you don't give charity to the poor, he says, I'm going to send you to the same place as the devil and his angels. Oops. That's a commandment of obedience, to do something, some actual act. Revolutionary is what this man, Mr. H.G. Wells, was saying. Revolutionary, that you have to do charity to enter heaven. Yes, Jesus says if you don't do charity, you'll go to the same place the devil and angels go. So if you take care of the stranger, you take care of the brother and sister with help when they need it. They need food, water, and clothing, or visit in a prison, whatever it is. Jesus says do it in Matthew 25. So Jesus and Paul are totally on different pages. And what did Jesus say? He gave you a hard way, right? Being charitable to others is hard because you have to sacrifice something. You have to sacrifice something yours. Paul's going to say that's earning your salvation. He's going to smear it as somehow doing something wrong that's going to lead you to boast. But Jesus says you absolutely have to do it. It's a duty. It's an obligation. It's not something you could just throw out and toss in the garbage of history. Like Jesus is a nothing burger. And that's actually what a lot of Christians say, that Jesus came and he failed, and we have to follow Paul. So if you follow some of the rationales of why people actually teach that, you'd learn that's what they believe, that Jesus is somebody we really don't have to follow because he was rejected of men. Oh my gosh, that's not what God saw. God saw who he really was. He was his Messiah. He was his voice, and Jesus was the prophet of Deuteronomy 18. But I won't go into that now. That's why he's so revolutionary. The Father was speaking through him, and that's what God, Yahweh, had promised to send a prophet like Moses in Deuteronomy 18, verses 16 to 19. Go read Acts 3, verses 23 to 24, where Peter, Apostle Peter, says Jesus is the prophet of Deuteronomy 18, and if you don't obey him, you will be cast off from God's people. There you go. That's why he gives a message of salvation, which is hard, but it's the way that leads to life. But if you take that easy way Paul gives you, which is just believe in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, as you read in 1 Corinthians 15, 1-4, that's the way that's going to lead you to destruction. Is this not? Once you see it, my friends, you cannot unsee it. You can see a man objectively reading history, objectively admiring, obviously, Jesus's words, revolutionary moral teachings. That's what he's admiring, while you have this other version, which is subtle, complex, and its notable merit is that it is without any serious disturbance of the believer's ordinary habits and occupations. You can just stay exactly as you are. You don't have to change, and God's going to accept you just as you are. When in fact, God says right here in the 10 Commandments, no way. I only show mercy to those who what? Love me, not believe in me. Who love me? That means you not only believe in him, but you actually love him by doing what? By keeping his commandments. All right. And I hope that helps you. Ciao. Bye.
Give your life to Christ tonight. Let him give you a new heart, make you a new person, and give you the joy and the peace that you've always longed for. Now, it'll cost you something. It doesn't come cheap. It cost Christ his blood. It cost God his Son, and it'll cost you your sins. He demands that you deny self, take up the cross, take his unpopularity, take your place with him in suffering if need be, but in return he'll give you a new heart. He'll accept you into his kingdom. He'll forgive the past. He'll make you a new creation.
That was Billy preaching in 1957.